Hello, welcome to Board with Paint's Divinity Original Sin, the board game, painting tutorial series. In this series, I'll show you step by step how to paint each of the miniatures from Divinity Original Sin. These tutorials, and specifically this video, is geared towards beginning painters. If you have some experience in miniature painting, you may want to skip this video and go directly to episode 1. For those of you still with us, this video will show you everything that you need to get started. Obviously, first you'll need the miniatures themselves. These are the 4 tutorial miniatures: Ifin, Fane, Losa, and Sabil. Next, you'll need a cup or jar of water. You'll be using this both to thin your paint and to clean your brushes when you're done with them. And speaking of brushes, you'll need some of those. If you're just getting started, I recommend having at least 3. One fairly good brush for detail work, a larger brush for base coating, and kind of a throwaway brush for mixing paint. It can also be useful to have some other lower quality brushes lying around for dry brushing and other techniques. Then you'll want to have a palette where you can put out and mix different paints. This is an example of a dry palette. You can just put some paint in these wells here. These work fine. I usually use a wet palette. These can be helpful for keeping your paint wet for longer. It's basically a tray filled with water. There's a foam or sponge insert, and then a piece of parchment paper on top, and that's where the paint goes. The idea is that the water seeps up through the paper and keeps your paint wet, and you can use this to mix paint and also preserve it between painting sessions. Now, in general, you don't want to apply paint directly to the miniature. You want to put a primer on it first. There are many options for this, but for this tutorial series, I decided to keep it simple, and I picked up a can of Army Painter black primer. We'll spray all the miniatures with this before we paint them. Once the painting is complete, you'll want to apply a varnish to protect the miniature and to keep the paint from chipping off. I almost exclusively use this Tester's spray lacquer. This gives it a nice matte finish. Then, of course, the paints. These are the paints I'll be using for the entire tutorial. These are the same colors that come in the Vallejo paint set that came with the Divinity Original Sin Kickstarter if you ordered it. That should be all the equipment you need to get started. Now let's look at the miniatures themselves. A lot of times there are defects in the miniature that show up as part of the casting process. If you want to have a nice clean paint job, you may want to try removing these flaws. Here I'm showing you some mold lines on the Ifin miniature. Mold lines occur where the 2 pieces of the mold meet and a little bit of the material squeezes out during the process. This can leave a small unsightly line along the edges of the miniature. Removing them is fairly straightforward. I'm going to use a few things, starting with an X-Acto knife. I'm also going to use a little sanding stick. You can pick these up at any hobby store. This one has a coarse and a fine side. And finally, I'll be using a toothbrush to brush off any of the dust that gets created while we're going through this process. So first, I go through and I find any mold lines I want to get rid of, and I take the knife and simply scrape them off. We don't want to cut gouges into the miniature. We just want to slide the blade over the surface and smooth it out. Using an older blade that's a little bit dull can help you not gouge out the miniature and also protect you from cutting yourself. So as I look at this miniature, I notice there's a little bit of a gap on the cape. We'll fix that later a different way. Here I'm trying to move other mold lines from between the legs here. I found some on the side of the boots. Some of these more textured surfaces can be a little bit difficult to get the mold lines off. Now we want to go through, and anywhere that left some roughness, where we weren't too precise with our blade, we can use the sanding stick to get them nice and smooth. I usually give it a quick pass with the coarse side, and then a little more on the fine side. And I'm basically just going over all the places that I scrape mold lines off and sanding it down a little bit. This process creates a lot of dust and leaves residue all over the miniature. This is where our toothbrush comes in. And we just brush all of that off. Now we'll return to that gap that was on the cape. I'll show you how to fill that. For this, I'm going to use some Vallejo plastic putty. There are various other things you can use for this. A lot of people use green stuff, but for really small gaps, I feel like this does just fine. We just put a little bit on a palette here. Then we get a brush that we don't mind ruining and get a little bit on the brush. And we essentially paint this over the gap and make sure it fills in the area. So you may want to put it on pretty thick. Now to smooth it out, we'll wet our brush a little bit and then wipe most of the water off on our paper towel. We don't want to get water all over the place. And then we just sort of feather it out around the edges. If it ends up looking a little uneven, once it dries, we can sand it down and make it smooth. Once all the putty is dry, we can move on to priming the miniatures. I like to do several at a time so you waste less primer. And the way I do this is I get a piece of cardboard and some poster putty and stick the miniatures onto the cardboard. Then we'll take this to a well-ventilated area, or my garage because it's raining. You want to grab your primer and give it a good shake since it's essentially spray paint. Then we spray all the miniatures with it. Make sure we go from all directions so that the entire miniature is covered. You don't necessarily need to get a fully solid black coat on these, since we're going to paint over the entire miniature. Even a very light coat of primer can help the paint stick to the miniature. And here's our fully primed miniatures. You can then pop them off the cardboard and get them ready for painting. The last thing we'll want to do right before we paint the miniature is to mount the miniature on some kind of a plinth or handle. I usually just attach them to these pieces of dowel with a piece of poster putty, but you can also purchase dedicated miniature handles or just find something around the house, like a pill bottle or an old salt shaker or something. And with that, you should be ready to paint your first miniature. Head on over to episode 1 and I'll show you how to paint Iffin. Good luck and happy painting.